So, if you'll forgive me, there's a matter that requires your attention. Gabriel waited for God to speak. This cantankerous mood had been going on for weeks, and God's temper had a way of affecting everything. The angel cleared his throat and waited to see what form their leader would take. When these cranky states took him, there was no predicting which way things would go. All right, get on with it. God was leaning back in his chair, and Gabriel was relieved to see that he was dressed conservatively. Not that superficial appearances could provide a reliable guide, but a beard and flowing robe usually indicated trouble. The thought of another tantrum was terrifying, probably the old man's intention in the first place. Irritability didn't make for a comfortable life for the rest of them, even if they were in heaven. I'm sure you'll remember the last time someone made an awkward suggestion, Gabriel said. Being on the team didn't save Lucifer, and we're all terrified of starting something that could be divisive. We haven't quite recovered from the last situation. The first part of Gabriel's speech was complete. It was as far as he had managed to get with his preparations before he'd been summoned to the inner sanctum. That was gossip. Everyone knows I'm forgiving. The atmosphere grew heavy, but God had turned his back and was contemplating a view of creation, refusing his assistant a chance to make his point. What I mean, sir, is that some of us felt there'd been a slight overreaction, and it may have been better if... Oh dear, I beg your pardon. Even the apology faded into nothingness as the archangel found himself dismissed from the almighty presence. Down below, the world spun slowly on its eccentric axis. God thought of all the inconsistency that could have been avoided if he hadn't been so trusting. If he'd considered these problems for even a single moment, it would have been clear that untested angels weren't ready for responsibility. He should have insisted on close supervision instead of handing over the blueprint and hoping they'd get it right. To be fair, Gabriel hadn't actually been unreliable since his promotion to the top spot. He was a fine figure, even after all these years, although recently he'd become so fussy. It was time for him to take a sabbatical. Any more confused talk would certainly be grounds for dismissal, gross dereliction of duty or something like that. The details could be worked out later. We looked at all possibilities, sir. Without the tilt, we had trouble with the seasons. I know you said we shouldn't bother, but there were complications, and the compromise eradicated many of our problems. Gabriel's hesitant form had reappeared in the corner of the office. It wasn't a question of eavesdropping, but recently the immortal being had developed a habit of thinking aloud. Didn't I send you away? God demanded, but it was difficult to insist. It wasn't realistic to ask any angel to stay away when he was summoned by a thought. From his position across the table, Gabriel could see that his master had been reading. Today they were using the mahogany desk from Thailand, but it wasn't clear what that meant. Business and tradition, fairness and reliability. A big change of some sort was coming, that much was evident. God's back was turned and Gabriel leaned in to read the papers on the wooden surface. Contracts? His own and Michael? All right, Gabriel, you've done well, but I think you should know that you'll be leaving. God was still looking out the window. A decision had been taken. You said not to bother you with every detail, that you didn't want to know. Gabriel wasn't sure if his participation was required, but what else could he do? There you go again. You blather on and never get to the point. God turned around. His suit was familiar but rumpled. This had never happened before. Of course, they'd all heard rumors, but there was no knowing which stories were actually true. I'm letting you go. God spoke without emotion. No, I don't want to see that mournful look. Your compensation will be adequate, and there's no need to be thinking about tribunals. May I ask who'll be replacing me? Apparently it was going to be Michael. Why else was there a second document on the table? Gabriel was determined to be dignified, even if his thoughts were in turmoil. Would you like me to deal with the handover? It was plain to see that God was losing interest. He was muttering under his breath about the perils of favoritism. Enjoy your holiday, was all he would say. Michael emerged even as his colleague faded from the scene. He hadn't been in central office since before the fall, and was surprised to discover he was alone. In recent years, there'd been no reason for a private audience. There you are. I've given Gabriel his marching orders. God broke into the newcomer's thoughts, directing him to the single chair and gesturing for him to sit. Officially, we can't say it's permanent, and if he's ever fit for duty, we may have to take him back. Right then. I'm sure you're anxious to make a start. Just remember what happened to your gibbering predecessor, and I'm sure you'll settle in. Gabriel returned. He was accustomed to being summoned back and forth, but this time he had thought the ordeal was finally over. Gabriel, what are you doing here? I thought we agreed you would take time for reflection. All of a sudden, God was on his feet, struggling to contain his temper. For the moment, heaven remained unaltered, but on Venus, storms were raging. Go on, leave, both of you. God dismissed them with a wave. But they were unable to shift. Even as he turned his attention elsewhere, they stayed on, like bit part players in the background. Excuse me, sir. Gabriel was no longer in post, but Michael didn't have the experience to deal with a crisis of this magnitude. He resolved to make one last attempt. There's no way of approaching the subject, and it makes us look bad going round in circles. Perhaps it would help if you thought we should be more direct. Get on with it. There, you have your instructions. Now spit it out. What the devil's wrong with you? The angels stepped back, ashen where they would once have been radiant. Tales of God's temper may have leaked out in the past, but a detail like this had to be kept secret. The D word could only mean something terrible. Gabriel looked across at Michael. It was a long time since they had worked together, and the junior remained as youthful as ever. Maybe God was right. Gabriel could remember a time when he himself had been so innocent, but the unrelenting pressure had taken its toll. All traces of enthusiasm had disappeared, and the need for measured behavior had created an endless capacity for prevarication and rationalization. Gabriel shook his head, wondering how much time had passed during these contemplations. Luckily, God had other things on his mind, and they were no longer center stage. Michael looked across and smiled. It was apparent he didn't understand the peril of their predicament. The Lord of Heaven turned to them with a face of thunder. Michael still had that impish grin. Gabriel braced himself. This time you've gone too far. God didn't need to shout. His wrath was all-consuming. The prospect of neverness and nothingness loomed. Before long, no sound would make it over the darkening sea of anger, and all would be lost. Wasn't it better to slink away and fail? Slings, arrows, outrageous fortune. The reality hit home, but nobody said a word. It was now or never. Gabriel chose his destiny and stepped forward to ensure Michael was protected. Then, looking directly at their leader, he spoke with all the courage he could muster. It's you who needs the break, sir, not me. Thank you very much.